Mr. Speaker. In setting a price on carbon today, the Prime Minister made the assumption that that price will actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully not have any detrimental impact on the Canadian economy. In setting a price, and in doing so, one would assume that the Prime Minister has done a detailed analysis of the inelasticity of carbon prices in Canada. So I'm wondering if my colleague opposite can validate the Prime Minister's assumption that a $50 tax on carbon will actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by stating the data on inelasticities for carbon pricing that the government used to make this decision.
The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for her excellent question. As we all know, 80% of Canadians already live in a jurisdiction with a price on carbon. And I know that our Minister of Environment and Climate Change is working very hard to try to see if we can bring that to 100%. Carbon pricing, as we all know, is just one of several measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that's currently being discussed by the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And we know that carbon pricing policies help to do a number of things, including minimize the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, providing a continuous incentive to technology, innovation, and transition to a low-carbon economy, achieve significant emissions reductions, and provide consumers and business with flexibility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the honourable member from Davenport for talking about solutions and how we all have to be part of change. She talked about how we need to live, think, and work differently. She talked about cycling. We know that if we're going to meet targets of reducing emissions by 30% by 2030, that we're being told that that would mean the equivalent to every car and truck on the road being removed. We know that's not realistic. So we have to come up with new strategies, alternative strategies to get people moving differently, promote active transportation. In countries around the world, they've developed a national cycling strategy, for example, in countries like the Netherlands and Denmark and Germany. In Canada, right now, 2% of children are traveling to school by bicycle. In Germany, 15%, Sweden, 20%, and in the Netherlands, 50%. We need a national cycling strategy to be a cycling nation, to get people using different modes of transportation. But this isn't the only solution. We know we need to take a heavy approach to making sure that polluters pay, but I want to hear from the member from Davenport if she supports creating a national strategy with measurable targets to get people cycling that brings industry together, promotes education, safety, and infrastructure to have a national cycling strategy here in Canada. Tomorrow, I'll be tabling a bill for the call for a national cycling strategy, and I hope the honourable member will be joining me in showing up in support of this bill.
The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his excellent question. As many know, within caucus and in this House, I'm a huge champion of cycling and of active transportation, and I've been a very active member talking to our Minister of Infrastructure about the importance of it, particularly in a downtown riding like Davenport, where you have so much traffic, literally the only way you actually can move is on paths, and so cycling becomes very, very important. So I will let you know, my understanding is that our Parliamentary Committee on Transport is currently looking at the national cycling strategy. I know that's something I would be very, very supportive of. I do know, though, in my riding, after 2 nights of very, very big debate with a lot of members of my riding, there was a very clear understanding that we have to always remember that we have to both grow and build a strong economy while we're protecting the environment. And we know that there's always that balance and that tension that we always have to keep in mind as we're moving forward and to aggressively achieve our COP21 targets. But know that I'm a very, very big supporter of cycling and very big supporter of a national cycling strategy. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be splitting my time with my very honourable colleague from Yellowhead. Mr. Speaker, I'm an Albertan MP who represents families who are standing on the brink in the middle of a jobs crisis, and I will not stand in this place and vote to support a significant tax increase that will burden Canadian families for which this government has provided no details. And mark my words, Mr. Speaker, the devil is in the details that the Prime Minister conveniently left out of his speech today. First, there's virtually no data on any region in Canada proving the Prime Minister's tax would actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Here's the question that the Prime Minister and my colleague from Davenport couldn't answer. At what price does the demand for gasoline, heating fuel, and other carbon products actually decrease in Canada? By how much and over what time period? If demand is mostly inelastic, then the Prime Minister's tax will increase government revenue without any reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to show for it. Simply put, if gas is 90 cents a litre or $2.50 a litre, Canadians are still likely to fill up their cars. And if natural gas goes up significantly, and it's minus 30 in Winnipeg, furnaces are still going to be turned on. It's just going to cost them more, either in money or opportunity. Along this line of thought, Mark Lee, a senior economist for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, wrote of BC's carbon tax. The reality is that since 2010, BC's greenhouse gas emissions have increased every year, and as of 2013, they are up 4.3% above 2010 levels. If the Prime Minister wants to take more of our money, he should be able to tell us where it's going to go. Will revenue from this tax be dumped into the offsetting of the Liberal deficit? Would it fund the development of new technology? And how much would it cost to implement the administration of this new tax? Without any of this information, the Prime Minister can't tell Canadians what the impact of his tax on Canadian workers and lower-income Canadians will be. Without this information, there's no way he can pretend to say that this tax is revenue neutral. Because carbon products are highly inelastic and pervasive, the reality is the tax the Prime Minister announced today is likely to look and act a lot like an increase to the GST. Further, the Prime Minister isn't talking about the development or adoption horizon of alternative technology that could alter these assumptions over time, or what the effect of his tax are on different income brackets and industries will be. If he can't answer if one region of the country will be affected more than others, he can't provide Canadians with assurances that this will work. And he also can't answer if rural and urban Canadians will be affected differently. We also need to look globally. In order to see the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions across the world, major emitting countries need to take actions. Nations such as China, which emits over 20% of total global emissions, and the United States, with nearly 18% of global emissions, have ratified the Paris Agreement. Compared to initiatives like the Kyoto Protocol, this is a marked improvement, as previous agreements did not see all major emitters commit to targets. This is important in the context of Canada's overall greenhouse gas emissions profile, which is 1.95% of all global emissions, and Canada has a relatively low greenhouse gas emissions profile. A question the PM can't ignore is that even if Canada imposes one of the most restrictive greenhouse gas emission frameworks in the world, what can we do to make major emitters like Brazil, India, China, and the United States reduce their greenhouse gas profiles? What happens if we implement a framework that makes our industries less competitive than those located in countries that aren't taking action? Have the billions of dollars that Canada has spent on global mitigation and adaptation efforts made any impact? It's completely irrational for the Prime Minister to impose new taxation measures on Canadians and let them pay the cost, while the biggest offenders take advantage of our potential economic inferiority as a result. The Prime Minister needs to address this dichotomy to have credibility with Canadians before he raids their pocketbooks with his new tax. At the very least, which he did not do today, he needs to explain how our domestic policy will align in the North American context. And contrary to the Prime Minister's assertion, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions profile is in a much better place than when the last Liberal government was in power. Recent Canadian emissions trends report shows that regulations on specific high-emission sectors, such as vehicles and the coal-fired electricity sector, have reduced our overall greenhouse gas emissions growth. More importantly, this has happened while the Canadian economy has grown. The decoupling of economic growth in Canada's natural resource-intensive economy from greenhouse gas emissions growth is significant positive progress. Any national greenhouse gas emissions framework should set achievable targets. It should be fully costed and measured via arm's-length data collection programs. It should simultaneously reduce greenhouse gas emissions and protect the job security of Canadian workers, the jurisdiction of provinces, and lower-income Canadians. And this all means that presenting a price on carbon as a painless, stand-all cure-all, as this government and this Prime Minister is doing, is a costly fallacy in the cold, regionalized, natural resource-intensive Canadian economy. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take action. It's saying that the Prime Minister's dogma on a new tax without any proof that it will actually work, coupled with his intrusion into provincial jurisdiction, will inhibit the development of a multifaceted approach which recognizes Canada's uniqueness. Among many instruments, Canada could include phased-in sector-specific regulations. You'll note the current government isn't talking about repealing regulations put in place by the previous government. Clean technology development and adoption. It must leverage energy efficiency standards and incentives and involve working with conservation groups who understand the importance of the sustainable management of Canada's forests and wetlands. It also must involve First Nations communities whose traditional knowledge has long helped sustain our country's environmental health. If it's going to include a tax, then it has to address the concerns that I've raised here today, and I highly doubt the Prime Minister is going to be able to do that. The Prime Minister also needs to acknowledge that we are not a European country when we compare international greenhouse gas reduction policy to ourselves. The practical reality is that it's cold here. We live far apart. We're a young country with a developing public transit infrastructure. And as such, the plan needs to involve smart long-term urban planning, public transit investments, and investment in disaster mitigation infrastructure. The Prime Minister's tax will require the financial sacrifice of Canadians, and Canadians should have a say in whether or not they want to make it. They should be aware of the costs, which shouldn't be hidden in line items on electricity bills to avoid political scrutiny, the way the Ontario Liberals have shamefully gone about doing. To gain credibility, the Liberals need to move away from mythology on this issue. There's no evidence to back up assertions that a carbon tax would instantly result in the United States allowing us to build projects like KXL. They should admit that the few rich CEOs of Canada's big energy firms probably support their tax because it may force junior firms out of the market, enabling them to make a play for assets. The energy sector is not these CEOs, it's workers. And right now they are laid off and getting by on their credit card. They are not asking for more taxes. It's also worth noting that the last time the Liberals were in power, greenhouse gas emissions rose by 30%. So I don't trust this government to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I certainly don't trust them to do it without killing the jobs of my constituents. That's because in 1980, the father of the current Prime Minister announced a similar pan-Canadian strategy, which used words such as fairness and opportunities in its objectives. This colossally disastrous social engineering experiment that was the National Energy Program forced thousands of Albertans out of their home and set the Canadian economy back for a generation. Today, the Liberal Prime Minister is embarking down the same path his father did, imposing a significant tax on the provinces without detail and encroaching on their jurisdiction, coupled with other policy that is decimating investment prospects of the development of our energy sector during a time of economic stagnation, frankly, is history repeating itself. Notably absent from the Prime Minister's tax announcement today is the corresponding research showing what effect this will have on the energy sector in Canada and on the millions of jobs dependent on our continued economic success derived from Canada's abundance of natural resources. Last week, the Liberals stood here and said the main reason why energy infrastructure projects aren't proceeding is because, quote, right now the issue is low commodity prices. Isn't that convenient? This shows a complete ignorance of the criteria that job-creating companies use to make investment decisions in the energy sector. Certainty is needed to make multi-billion-dollar energy sector investment commitments. Quasi-changing, interim principally environmental assessment processes in a closed, unpredictable, and non-transparent way. Unpredictable increases in taxation, such as the CPP increase and today's new tax, create uncertainty that puts a chill on job creators. And they refuse to admit that market access is a critical factor in seeing the value of Canada's energy resources translate into things like jobs and social programs, made evident in their silence regarding support for pipelines. While the Liberal government was busy initiating new taxes on a region that is already struggling to stay on its feet, today we started the Alberta Jobs Task Force. The inconvenient truth that we're dealing with here today, Mr. Speaker, is that these questions need to be answered. There's a lot at stake. With the government failing to do so, once again, all that the Liberals will have left Canadians is debt, uncertainty, job losses, increases in greenhouse gas emissions, and a dog named Kyoto.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for that trip down memory lane, the nostalgic trip down memory lane of my university days, talking about the elasticity and demand of certain products in the market. But what I think she neglects to realize is that it is the tax, the government intervention, which is specifically going to change the elasticity of the demand of fossil fuels in this particular case. By government intervening and by government making it easier for companies to be more efficient, to change the way they do business, to become more environmentally friendly and reduce the emissions will directly result in the demand becoming more elastic, and consumers can then have a choice, preferably a choice towards making the responsible decision of being environmentally friendly and not polluting.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, for the soccer mom who has 5 kids and a Dodge Caravan to fill up, if the price of gas goes from 90 cents a litre to $2.50 a litre, she still has to get her kids to school, she still has to get to work, she still has to run errands, she still has to do a lot of things. She still has to fill up her demand. She still has to fill up her van. The price that you put on the whole point of price elasticity is there's a price at which demand changes. The government is intervening there, which will actually, this is the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard. I really hope that my colleague goes back to Economics 101. And I certainly hope that the Prime Minister can stand in this House and answer the most basic of questions. If the government cannot show data that in a cold, sparsely populated country where we have to drive to go places and we have to heat our homes, that demand is not going to change because of their tax, it is not going to affect the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. All it's going to do is increase the cost of everything. That is why this is the #1 fallacy. This is why economists raise this as an issue over and over again, and this government wants Canadians to forget this because they want more tax dollars for their ridiculous spending.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Drummond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais remercier ma collègue pour son discours. J'ai eu l'occasion de travailler avec elle au comité de l'environnement et du développement durable. Et puis, on a vu les rapports des commissaires à l'environnement, les uns et les autres, se succéder et qui ont mentionné que sous les conservateurs, malheureusement, les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, le plan des conservateurs ne permettait pas d'atteindre leur faible cible. Mais malgré cela, j'avoue, je vais donner à ma collègue conservatrice le fait que les libéraux ont repris cette même cible qu'ils vous ont critiquée. Alors, comment trouvez-vous qu'il est un peu ridicule que les libéraux reprennent une cible qu'ils ont critiquée eux-mêmes?
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I actually think we should have a conversation in here about targets. Across party lines, the discussion on greenhouse gas emissions target in Canada has been, my arbitrary target is bigger than yours. In order for Canada to be able to have any, or the government to have any credibility in going to Canadians and raiding their pocketbooks with a new tax, they should be able to say why the target that they've put in place is achievable and what impacts it will have on each sector and each section of the Canadian economy. This is a discussion that we've not had in Canada. You know, I wish that we could elevate the debate beyond good versus evil on this particular issue, but the reality is that unless the government looks beyond the dogma of a revenue grab on this and looks at ways to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're never going to see change in Canada. And we also need to look beyond our borders. So I think that the government, Mr. Speaker, has significantly oversimplified this issue, and they're doing it at the detriment of Canadians and their livelihoods.